What is property? An inquiry into the principle of right and of government, by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Chapter 4, Part 1. That property is impossible. The last resort of proprietors, the overwhelming argument whose invincible potency reassures them, is that, in their opinion, equality of conditions is impossible. Equality of conditions is a chimera, they cry with a knowing air. Distribute wealth equally to day. To morrow this equality will have vanished. To this hackneyed objection, which they repeat everywhere with the most marvellous assurance, they never fail to add the following comment, as a sort of glory be to the Father: If all men were equal, nobody would work. This anthem is sung with variations. If all were masters, nobody would obey. If nobody were rich, who would employ the poor? And, if nobody were poor, who would labor for the rich? But let us have done with the invective. We have better arguments at our command. If I show that property itself is impossible, that it is property which is a contradiction, a chimera, a utopia, and if I show it no longer by metaphysics and jurisprudence, but by figures, equations, and calculations, imagine the fright of the astounded proprietor. And you, reader, what do you think of the retort? Numbers govern the world. Mundum regunt numeri. This proverb applies as aptly to the moral and political as to the sidereal and molecular world. The elements of justice are identical with those of algebra. Legislation and government are simply the arts of classifying and balancing powers. All jurisprudence falls within the rules of arithmetic. This chapter and the next will serve to lay the foundations of this extraordinary doctrine. Then will be unfolded to the reader's vision an immense and novel career. Then shall we commence to see in numerical relations the synthetic unity of philosophy and the sciences; and, filled with admiration and enthusiasm for this profound and majestic simplicity of nature, we shall shout with the apostle, "Yes, the Eternal has made all things by number, weight, and measure." We shall understand not only that equality of conditions is impossible, but that all else is impossible; that this seeming impossibility which we charge upon it arises from the fact that we always think of it in connection either with the proprietary or the communistic régime, political systems equally irreconcilable with human nature. We shall see finally that inequality is constantly being realized without our knowledge, even at the very moment when we are pronouncing it incapable of realization; that the time draws near when, without any effort or even wish of ours, we shall have it universally established; that with it, in it, and by it, the natural and true political order must make itself manifest. It has been said, in speaking of the blindness and obstinacy of the passions, that, if man had anything to gain by denying the truths of arithmetic, he would find some means of unsettling their certainty. Here is an opportunity to try this curious experiment. I attack property, no longer with its own maxims, but with arithmetic. Let the proprietors prepare to verify my figures; for, if unfortunately for them, the figures prove accurate, the proprietors are lost. In proving the impossibility of property, I complete the proof of its injustice. In fact, that which is just must be useful; that which is useful must be true; that which is true must be possible. Therefore everything which is impossible is untrue, useless, unjust. Then, a priori, we may judge of the justice of anything by its possibility; so that if the thing were absolutely impossible, it would be absolutely unjust. Property is physically and mathematically impossible. Demonstration. Axiom: Property is the right of increase claimed by the proprietor over anything which he has stamped as his own. This proposition is purely an axiom, because 1. It is not a definition, since it does not express all that is included in the right of property: the right of sale, of exchange, of gift; the right to transform, to alter, to consume, to destroy, to use and abuse, etc. All these rights are so many different powers of property, which we may consider separately, but which we disregard here, that we may devote all our attention to this single one, the right of increase. 2. It is universally admitted; no one can deny it without denying the facts, without being instantly belied by universal custom. 3. It is self evident; since property is always accompanied, either actually or potentially, by the fact which this axiom expresses, and through this fact, mainly, property manifests, establishes, and asserts itself. 4. Finally, its negation involves a contradiction. The right of increase is really an inherent right, so essential a part of property that, in its absence, property is null and void. Observations. Increase receives different names according to the thing by which it is yielded. If by land, farm rent; if by houses and furniture, rent; if by life investments, revenue; if by money, interest; if by exchange, advantage, gain, profit; three things which must not be confounded with the wages or legitimate price of labor. Increase, a sort of royal prerogative, of tangible and consumable homage, is due to the proprietor on account of his nominal and metaphysical occupancy. His seal is set upon the thing; that is enough to prevent any one else from occupying it without his permission. This permission to use his things the proprietor may, if he chooses, freely grant. Commonly he sells it. This sale is really a stellionate and an extortion; but by the legal fiction of the right of property, this same sale, severely punished, we know not why, in other cases, is a source of profit and value to the proprietor. The amount demanded by the proprietor in payment for this permission is expressed in monetary terms by the dividend which the supposed product yields in nature; so that, by the right of increase, the proprietor reaps and does not plow, gleans and does not till, consumes and does not produce, enjoys and does not labor. Very different from the idols of the Psalmist are the gods of property. The former had hands and felt not; the latter, on the contrary, manus habent et palpabunt. The right of increase is conferred in a very mysterious and supernatural manner. The inauguration of a proprietor is accompanied by the awful ceremonies of an ancient initiation. First comes the consecration of the article, a consecration which makes known to all that they must offer up a suitable sacrifice to the proprietor, whenever they wish, by his permission obtained and signed, to use his article. Second comes the anathema, which prohibits, except on the conditions aforesaid, all persons from touching the article, even in the proprietor's absence, and pronounces every violator of property sacrilegious, infamous, amenable to the secular power, and deserving of being handed over to it. Finally, the dedication, which enables the proprietor or patron saint, the god chosen to watch over the article, to inhabit it mentally like a divinity in his sanctuary. By means of this dedication, the substance of the article, so to speak, becomes converted into the person of the proprietor, who is regarded as ever present in its form. This is exactly the doctrine of the writers on jurisprudence. Property, says Toullier, is a moral quality inherent in a thing, an actual bond which fastens it to the proprietor, and which cannot be broken save by his act. Locke humbly doubted whether God could make matter intelligent. Toullier asserts that the proprietor renders it moral. How much does he lack of being a god? These are by no means exaggerations. Property is the right of increase, that is, the power to produce without labor. Now, to produce without labor is to make something from nothing; in short, to create. Surely it is no more difficult to do this than to moralize matter. The jurists are right, then, in applying to proprietors this passage from the Scriptures: Ego dixi, Dii estis et filii excelsi omnes. I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. Property is the right of increase. To us this axiom shall be like the name of the beast in the Apocalypse. a name in which is hidden the complete explanation of the whole mystery of the beast. It was known that he should solve the mystery of this name would obtain a knowledge of the whole prophecy, and would succeed in mastering the beast. Well, by the most careful interpretation of our axiom, we shall kill the Sphinx of property. Starting from this eminently characteristic fact, the right of increase, we shall pursue the old serpent through his coils; we shall count the murderous entwinings of this frightful Tænia, whose head, with its thousand suckers, is always hidden from the sword of its most violent enemies, though abandoning to them immense fragments of its body. It requires something more than courage to subdue this monster. It was written that it should not die until a proletaire, armed with the magic wand, had fought with it. Corollaries. 1. The amount of increase is proportional to the thing increased. Whatever be the rate of interest, whether it rise to 3, 5, or 10 per cent, or fall to 1/2, 1/4, 1/10, it does not matter. The law of increase remains the same. The law is as follows: all capital, the cash value of which can be estimated, may be considered as a term in an arithmetical series which progresses in the ratio of 100, and the revenue yielded by this capital as the corresponding term of another arithmetical series which progresses equal to the rate of interest. Thus, a capital of 500 francs being the fifth term of the arithmetical progression whose ratio is 100, its revenue at 3 per cent will be indicated by the fifth term of the arithmetical progression whose ratio is 3. 100, 3. 200, 6. 300, 9. 400, 12. 500, 15. An acquaintance with this sort of logarithms, tables of which, calculated to a very high degree, are possessed by proprietors, will give us the key to the most puzzling problems, and cause us to experience a series of surprises. By this logarithmic theory of the right of increase, a piece of property, together with its income, may be defined as a number whose logarithm is equal to the sum of its units divided by 100 and multiplied by the rate of interest. For instance, a house valued at 100,000 francs and leased at 5 per cent, yields a revenue of 5,000 francs, according to the formula 100,000 times 5 divided by 100 equals 5,000. Vice versa, a piece of land which yields at 2.5 per cent a revenue of 3,000 francs is worth 120,000 francs, according to this other formula 3,000 times 100 divided by 2.5 equals 120,000. In the first case, the ratio of the progression which marks the increase of interest is 5; in the second, it is 2.5. Observation. The forms of increase known as farm rent, income, and interest are paid annually. Rent is paid by the week, the month, or the year. Profits and gains are paid at the time of exchange. Thus the amount of increase is proportional both to the thing increased and the time during which it increases. In other words, usury grows like a cancer. Foenis serpit sicut cancer. 2. The increase paid to the proprietor by the occupant is a dead loss to the latter. For if the proprietor owed, in exchange for the increase which he receives, something more than the permission which he grants, his right of property would not be perfect. He would not possess jure optimo, jure perfecto; that is, he would not be in reality a proprietor. Then all which passes from the hands of the occupant into those of the proprietor in the name of the increase, and as the price of the permission to occupy, is a permanent gain for the latter, and a dead loss and an annihilation for the former, to whom none of it will return, save in the form of gift, alms, wages paid for his services, or the price of merchandise which he has delivered. In a word, increase perishes so far as the borrower is concerned, or, to use the more energetic Latin phrase, res perit solventi. 3. The right of increase oppresses the proprietor as well as the stranger. The master of a thing, as its proprietor, levies a tax for the use of his property upon himself as its possessor, equal to that which he would receive from a third party, so that the capital bears interest in the hands of the capitalist, as well as in those of the borrower and the commandite. If, indeed, rather than accept a rent of 500 francs for my apartment, I prefer to occupy and enjoy it, it is clear that I shall become my own debtor, for a rent equal to that which I deny myself. This principle is universally practiced in business, and is regarded as an axiom by economists. Manufacturers also, who have the advantage of being proprietors of their floating capital, although they owe no interest to any one, in calculating their profits, subtract from them not only their running expenses and the wages of their employees, but also the interest on their capital. For the same reason, money lenders retain in their own possession as little money as possible; for since all capital necessarily bears interest, if this interest is supplied by no one, it comes out of the capital, which is to that extent diminished. Thus, by the right of increase, capital eats itself up. This is, doubtless, the idea that Papinius intended to convey in the phrase as elegant as it is forcible, Foenus mordet solidam. I beg pardon for using Latin so frequently in discussing this subject; it is an homage which I pay to the most usurious nation that ever existed. First proposition: Property is impossible, because it demands something for nothing. The discussion of this proposition covers the same ground as that of the origin of farm rent which is so much debated by the economists. When I read the writings of the greater part of these men, I cannot avoid a feeling of contempt mingled with anger, in view of this mass of nonsense in which the detestable vies with the absurd. It would be a repetition of the story of the elephant in the moon, were it not for the atrocity of the consequences. To seek a rational and legitimate origin of that which is, and ever must be, only robbery, extortion, and plunder, that must be the height of the proprietor's folly, the last degree of bedevilment into which minds, otherwise judicious, can be thrown by the perversity of selfishness. A farmer, says Say, is a wheat manufacturer, who, among other tools which serve him in modifying the material from which he makes the wheat, employs one large tool, which we call a field. If he is not the proprietor of the field, if he is only a tenant, he pays the proprietor for the productive service of this tool. The tenant is reimbursed by the purchaser, the latter by another, until the product reaches the consumer, who redeems the first payment, plus all the others, by means of which the product has at last come into his hands. Let us lay aside the subsequent payments by which the product reaches the consumer, and for the present pay attention only to the first one of all, the rent paid to the proprietor by the tenant. On what ground, we ask, is the proprietor entitled to this rent? According to Ricardo, McCulloch, and Mill, farm rent, properly speaking, is simply the excessive product of the most fertile land over that of lands of an inferior quality, so that farm rent is not demanded for the former until the increase of population renders necessary the cultivation of the latter. It is difficult to see any sense in this. How can a right to the land be based upon a difference in the quality of the land? How can varieties of soil engender a principle of legislation and politics? The reasoning is either so subtle or so stupid, that the more I think of it, the more bewildered I become. Suppose two pieces of land of equal area, the one, A, capable of supporting 10,000 inhabitants, the other, B, capable of supporting 9,000 only. When, owing to an increase in their number, the inhabitants of A shall be forced to cultivate B, the landed proprietors of A will exact from their tenants in A a rent proportional to the difference between 10 and 9. So say, I think, Ricardo, McCulloch, and Mill. But if A supports as many inhabitants as it can, that is, if the inhabitants of A, by our hypothesis, have only just enough land to keep them alive, how can they pay farm rent? If they had gone no farther than to say that the difference in land has occasioned farm rent, instead of caused it, this observation would have taught us a valuable lesson, namely, that farm rent grew out of a desire for equality. Indeed, if all men have an equal right to the possession of good land, no one can be forced to cultivate bad land without indemnification. Farm rent, according to Ricardo, McCulloch, and Mill, would then have been a compensation for loss and hardship. This system of practical equality is a bad one, no doubt, but it sprang from good intentions. What argument can Ricardo, McCulloch, and Mill develop therefrom in favor of property? Their theory turns against themselves and strangles them. Malthus thinks that farm rent has its source in the power possessed by land of producing more than is necessary to supply the wants of the men who cultivate it. I would ask Malthus why successful labor should entitle the idle to a portion of the products. But the worthy Malthus is mistaken in regard to the fact. Yes, land has the power of producing more than is needed by those who cultivate it, if by cultivators is meant tenants only. The tailor also makes more clothes than he wears, and the cabinet maker more furniture than he uses. But, since the various professions imply and sustain one another, not only the farmer, but the followers of all arts and trades, even to the doctor and the school teacher, are and ought to be regarded as cultivators of the land. Malthus bases farm rent upon the principle of commerce. Now, the fundamental law of commerce being equivalence of the products exchanged, anything which destroys this equivalence violates the law. There is an error in the estimate which needs to be corrected. Buchanan, a commentator on Smith, regarded farm rent as the result of a monopoly, and maintained that labor alone is productive. Consequently, he thought that, without this monopoly, products would rise in price, and he found no basis for farm rent save in the civil law. This opinion is a corollary of that which makes the civil law the basis of property. And why has the civil law, which ought to be the written expression of justice, authorized this monopoly? Whoever says monopoly necessarily excludes justice. Now, to say that farm rent is a monopoly sanctioned by the law, is to say that injustice is based on justice, a contradiction in terms. Say, answers Buchanan, that the proprietor is not a monopolist, because a monopolist is one who does not increase the utility of the merchandise which passes through his hands. How much does the proprietor increase the utility of his tenant's products? Has he plowed, sowed, reaped, mowed, winnowed, weeded? These are the processes by which the tenant and his employees increase the utility of the material which they consume for the purpose of reproduction. The landed proprietor increases the utility of products by means of his implement, the land. This implement receives in one state, and returns in another, the materials of which wheat is composed. The action of the land is a chemical process, which so modifies the material that it multiplies it by destroying it. The soil is then a producer of utility; and when it, the soil, asks its pay in the form of profit, or farm rent, for its proprietor, it at the same time gives something to the consumer in exchange for the amount which the consumer pays it. It gives him a produced utility, and it is the production of this utility which warrants us in calling land productive, as well as labor. Let us clear up this matter. The blacksmith who manufactures for the farmer implements of husbandry, the wheelwright who makes him a cart, the mason who builds his barn, the carpenter, the basket maker, etc., all of whom contribute to agricultural production by the tools which they provide, are producers of utility; consequently they are entitled to a part of the products. Undoubtedly, says Say, but the land also is an implement whose service must be paid for. Then I admit that the land is an implement, but who made it? Did the proprietor? Did he, by the efficacious virtue of the right of property, by this moral quality infused into the soil, endow it with vigor and fertility? Exactly there lies the monopoly of the proprietor, in the fact that, though he did not make the implement, he asks pay for its use. When the Creator shall present himself and claim farm rent, we will consider the matter with him; or even when the proprietor, his pretended representative, shall exhibit his power of attorney. The proprietor's service, I'd say, is easy, I admit. It is a frank confession. But we cannot disregard it. Without property, one farmer would contend with another for the possession of a field without a proprietor, and the field would remain uncultivated. Then the proprietor's business is to reconcile farmers by robbing them. O logic! O justice! O the marvellous wisdom of economists! The proprietor, if they are right, is like Perindandin, who, when summoned by two travellers to settle a dispute about an oyster, opened it, gobbled it, and said to them, "The court awards you each a shell." Could anything worse be said of property? Will Say tell us why the same farmers who, if there were no proprietors, would contend with each other for possession of the soil, do not contend today with the proprietors for this possession? Obviously, because they think them legitimate possessors, and because their respect for even an imaginary right exceeds their avarice. I proved, in Chapter 2, that possession is sufficient, without property, to maintain social order. Would it be more difficult, then, to reconcile possessors without masters than tenants controlled by proprietors? Would laboring men, who respect, much to their own detriment, the pretended rights of the idler, violate the natural rights of the producer and the manufacturer? What, if the husbandman forfeited his right to the land as soon as he ceased to occupy it, would he become more covetous? And would the impossibility of demanding increase, of taxing another's labor, be a source of quarrels and lawsuits? The economists use singular logic, but we are not yet through. Admit that the proprietor is the legitimate master of the land. The land is an instrument of production, they say. That is true. But when, changing the noun into an adjective, they alter the phrase thus, "The land is a productive instrument," they make a wicked blunder. According to Quesnay and the early economists, all production comes from the land. Smith, Ricardo, and De Tracy, on the contrary, say that labor is the sole agent of production. Say, and most of his successors, teach that both land and labor and capital are productive. The latter constitute the eclectic school of political economy. The truth is, that neither land nor labor nor capital is productive. Production results from the co operation of these three equally necessary elements, which, taken separately, are equally sterile. Political economy, indeed, treats of the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth or values. But of what values? Of the values produced by human industry; that is, of the changes made in matter by man, that he may appropriate it to his own use, and not at all of nature's spontaneous productions. Man's labor consists in a simple laying on of hands. When he has taken that trouble, he has produced a value. Until then, the salt of the sea, the water of the springs, the grass of the fields, and the trees of the forests are to him as if they were not. The sea, without the fisherman and his line, supplies no fish. The forest, without the woodcutter and his axe, furnishes neither fuel nor timber. The meadow, without the mower, yields neither hay nor aftermath. Nature is a vast mass of material to be cultivated and converted into products, but Nature produces nothing for herself. In the economical sense, her products, in their relation to man, are not yet products. Capital, tools, and machinery are likewise unproductive. The hammer and the anvil, without the blacksmith and the iron, do not forge. The mill, without the miller and the grain, does not grind, etc. Bring tools and raw material together, place a plough and some seed on fertile soil, enter a smithy, light the fire, and shut up the shop, you will produce nothing. The following remark was made by an economist who possessed more good sense than most of his fellows. Say credits capital with an active part unwarranted by its nature; left to itself, it is an idle tool. J. Droz, Political Economy. Finally, labor and capital together, when unfortunately combined, produce nothing. Plough a sandy desert, beat the water of the rivers, pass type through a sieve; you will get neither wheat, nor fish, nor books. Your trouble will be as fruitless as was the immense labor of the army of Xerxes, who, as Herodotus says, with his 3,000,000 soldiers, scourged the Hellespont for 24 hours as a punishment for having broken and scattered the pontoon bridge which the great king had thrown across it. Tools and capital, land and labor, considered individually and abstractly, are not, literally speaking, productive. The proprietor who asks to be rewarded for the use of a tool, or the productive power of his land, takes for granted, then, that which is radically false, namely, that capital produces by its own effort; and, in taking pay for this imaginary product, he literally receives something for nothing. Objection. But if the blacksmith, the wheelwright, all manufacturers, in short, have a right to the products in return for the implements which they furnish, and if land is an implement of production, why does not this implement entitle its proprietor, be his claim real or imaginary, to a portion of the products, as in the case of the manufacturers of ploughs and wagons? Reply. Here we touch the heart of the question, the mystery of property, which we must clear up, if we would understand anything of the strange effects of the right of increase. He who manufactures or repairs the farmer's tools receives the price once, either at the time of delivery or in several payments; and when this price is once paid to the manufacturer, the tools which he has delivered belong to him no more. Never does he claim double payment for the same tool, or the same job of repairs. If he annually shares in the products of the farmer, it is owing to the fact that he annually makes something for the farmer. The proprietor, on the contrary, does not yield his implement. Eternally he is paid for it, eternally he keeps it. In fact, the rent received by the proprietor is not intended to defray the expense of maintaining and repairing the implement. This expense is charged to the borrower, and does not concern the proprietor, except as he is interested in the preservation of the article. If he takes it upon himself to attend to the repairs, he takes care that the money which he expends for this purpose is repaid. This rent does not represent the product of the implement, since of itself the implement produces nothing. We have just proved this, and we shall prove it more clearly still by its consequences. Finally, this rent does not represent the participation of the proprietor in the production, since this participation could consist, like that of the blacksmith and the wheelwright, only in the surrender of the whole or a part of his implement, in which case he would cease to be its proprietor, which would involve a contradiction in the idea of property. Then between the proprietor and his tenant there is no exchange either of values or services. Then, as our axiom says, farm rent is a real increase, an extortion based solely upon fraud and violence on the one hand, and weakness and ignorance upon the other. Products, say the economists, are bought only by products. The maxim is property's condemnation. The proprietor, producing neither by his own labor nor by his implement, and receiving products in exchange for nothing, is either a parasite or a thief. Then, if property can exist only as a right, property is impossible. Corollaries. 1. The Republican Constitution of 1793, which defined property as the right to enjoy the fruit of one's labor, was grossly mistaken. It should have said, property is the right to enjoy and dispose at will of another's goods, the fruit of another's industry and labor. 2. Every possessor of lands, houses, furniture, machinery, tools, money, etc., who lends a thing for a price exceeding the cost of repairs, the repairs being charged to the lender, and representing products which he exchanges for other products, is guilty of swindling and extortion. In short, all rent received, nominally as damages, but really as payment for a loan, is an act of property, a robbery. Historical comment. The tax which a victorious nation levies upon a conquered nation is genuine farm rent. The seigniorial rights abolished by the Revolution of 1789, tithes, mortmain, statute labor, etc., were different forms of the rights of property, and they who under the titles of nobles, seigneurs, prebendaries, etc., enjoyed these rights, were neither more nor less than proprietors. To defend property today is to condemn the Revolution. Second proposition: Property is impossible because wherever it exists production costs more than it is worth. The preceding proposition was legislative in its nature. This one is economical. It serves to prove that property which originates in violence results in waste. Production, says Say, is exchange on a large scale. To render the exchange productive, the value of the whole amount of service must be balanced by the value of the product. If this condition is not complied with, the exchange is unequal. The producer gives more than he receives. Now, value being necessarily based upon utility, it follows that every useless product is necessarily valueless, that it cannot be exchanged, and, consequently, that it cannot be given in payment for productive services. Then, though production may equal consumption, it never can exceed it, for there is no real production save where there is a production of utility, and there is no utility save where there is a possibility of consumption. Thus, so much of every product as is rendered by excessive abundance inconsumable, becomes useless, valueless, unexchangeable, consequently unfit to be given in payment for anything whatever, and so is no longer a product. Consumption, on the other hand, to be legitimate, to be true consumption, must be reproductive of utility. For if it is unproductive, the products which it destroys are cancelled values, things produced at a pure loss, a state of things which causes products to depreciate in value. Man has the power to destroy, but he consumes only that which he reproduces. Under a right system of economy, there is then an equation between production and consumption. These points established, let us suppose a community of 1,000 families, enclosed in a territory of a given circumference, and deprived of foreign intercourse. Let this community represent the human race, which, scattered over the face of the earth, is really isolated. In fact, the difference between a community and the human race being only a numerical one, the economical results will be absolutely the same in each case. Suppose, then, that these 1,000 families, devoting themselves exclusively to wheat culture, are obliged to pay to 100 individuals, chosen from the mass, an annual revenue of 10 per cent. On their product. Is it clear that, in such a case, the right of increase is equivalent to a tax levied in advance upon social production? Of what use is this tax? It cannot be levied to supply the community with provisions, for between that and farm rent there is nothing in common; nor to pay for services and products, for the proprietors, laboring like the others, have labored only for themselves. Finally, this tax is of no use to its recipients, who, having harvested wheat enough for their own consumption, and not being able in a society without commerce and manufactures to procure anything else in exchange for it, thereby lose the advantage of their income. In such a society, 1/10 of the product being inconsumable, 1/10 of the labor goes unpaid. Production costs more than it is worth. Now, change 300 of our wheat producers into artisans of all kinds, 100 gardeners and wine growers, 60 shoemakers and tailors, 50 carpenters and blacksmiths, 80 of various professions, and, that nothing may be lacking, 7 schoolmasters, 1 mayor, 1 judge, 1 priest. Each industry furnishes the whole community with its special product. Now, the total production being 1,000, each laborer's consumption is 1, namely, wheat, meat, and grain, 0.7; wine and vegetables, 0.1; shoes and clothing, 0.06; ironwork and furniture, 0.05; sundries, 0.08; instruction, 0.007; administration, 0.002; mass, 0.001; total, 1. But the community owes a revenue of 10 per cent., and it matters little whether the farmers alone pay it, or all the laborers are responsible for it, the result is the same. The farmer raises the price of his products in proportion to his share of the debt, and other laborers follow his example. Then, after some fluctuations, equilibrium is established, and all pay nearly the same amount of the revenue. It would be a grave error to assume that in a nation none but farmers pay farm rent. The whole nation pays it. I say, then, that by this tax of 10 per cent, each laborer's consumption is reduced as follows: wheat, 0.63; wine and vegetables, 0.09; clothing and shoes, 0.054; furniture and ironwork, 0.045; other products, 0.072; schooling, 0.0063; administration, 0.0018; mass, 0.0009; total, 0.9. The laborer has produced 1; he consumes only 0.9; he loses then 1/10 of the price of his labor; his production still costs more than it is worth. On the other hand, the 1/10 received by the proprietors is no less a waste, for, being laborers themselves, they, like the others, possess in the 9/10 of their product the wherewithal to live. They want for nothing. Why should they wish their proportion of bread, wine, meat, clothes, shelter, &c., to be doubted, if they can neither consume nor exchange them? Then farm rent, with them as with the rest of the laborers, is a waste, and perishes in their hands. Extend the hypothesis, increase the number and variety of the products, you still have the same result. Hitherto we have considered the proprietor as taking part in the production, not only, as Say says, by the use of his instrument, but in an effective manner and by the labor of his hands. Now, it is easy to see that under such circumstances property will never exist. What happens? The proprietor, an essentially libidinous animal, without virtue or shame, is not satisfied with an orderly and disciplined life. He loves property, because it enables him to do at leisure what he pleases, and when he pleases. Having obtained the means of life, he gives himself up to trivialities and indolence. He enjoys, he fritters away his time, he goes in quest of curiosities and novel sensations. Property, to enjoy itself, has to abandon ordinary life, and busy itself in luxurious occupations and unclean enjoyments. Instead of giving up a farm rent which is perishing in their hands, and thus lightening the labor of the community, 100 proprietors prefer to rest. In consequence of this withdrawal, the absolute production being diminished by 100, while the consumption remains the same, production and consumption seem to balance. But, in the first place, since the proprietors no longer labor, their consumption is, according to economical principles, unproductive. Consequently, the previous condition of the community, when the labor of 100 was rewarded by no products, is superseded by one in which the products of 100 are consumed without labor. The deficit is always the same, whichever the column of the account in which it is expressed. Either the maxims of political economy are false, or else property, which contradicts them, is impossible. The economists, regarding all unproductive consumption as an evil, as a robbery of the human race, never failed to exhort proprietors to moderation, labor, and economy. They preach to them the necessity of making themselves useful, of remunerating production for that which they receive from it. They launch the most terrible curses against luxury and laziness. Very beautiful morality, surely! It is a pity that it lacks common sense. The proprietor who labors, or, as the economists say, who makes himself useful, is paid for his labor and utility. Is he, therefore, any the less idle as concerns the property which he does not use, and from which he receives an income? His condition, whatever he may do, is an unproductive and felonious one. He cannot cease to waste and destroy without ceasing to be a proprietor. But this is only the least of the evils which property engenders. Society has to maintain some idle people, whether or no. It will always have the blind, the maimed, the insane, and the idiotic. It can easily support a few sluggards. At this point the impossibilities thicken and become complicated. Chapter 4.